Let's welcome our first presenters for today's seminar.
Thank you, Xiaohu, very much for your kind introduction. I will now present you with the research that Frank and I have been engaged in over the last 2 years, focusing on youth participation in Hong Kong with a focus on efficacy and grievances and their association with social movement participation. Slide. I will first give some background information on our study, and then Frank will talk about the analysis and results. So let's start with the socio-political context within the 2019 protests developed. Since the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, the city has been governed under the one country, two systems principle, within which Hong Kong has a distinct economic, judicial, and political system. But over the course of the last 2 decades, this model has become increasingly contested. Repeated public opinion polls have shown both a perceived decline in political freedoms and perceived increase in the influence of the Chinese Communist Party. In Hong Kong's lively protest scene, young people were heavily present in multiple of the protests since 2010. This has been credited to local youth political dissatisfaction. With the umbrella movement in 2014, these developments even accelerated. Previous ideological and strategic differences among civil society groups have widened, and young Hong Kongers became more heavily involved in party politics. In social movement research, this phase of post-protest institutionalization of activists has been previously observed, but in the case of Hong Kong, it faced several hurdles, as could be seen in the years since 2014. Young localist political candidates faced disqualification on different grounds, and these events added to the negative perception of institutional channels for civic engagement, especially among Hong Kong's youth. In 2019, the Hong Kong government introduced a legal amendment which would have allowed extradition to jurisdictions outside the city, including the Chinese mainland. This was met with large opposition from diverse groups and peaceful mass protests, but nonetheless, the government continued the hearings. A movement opposing the authorities developed, and young people, many with higher education background, were engaged. After 2014, infighting was discouraged and diverse camps coexisted in solidarity. This new framing of community was omnipresent in different aspects of the movement communication, as can be seen in this caricature by the artist Atoll. Another defining aspect were the movement aims, the so-called 5 demands, focusing on repressive politics and police tactics. They evolved only slightly in the beginning and have remained a core slogan of the movement, up to now, actually. Similar to the umbrella movement, there was a high reliance on digital technology for mobilization as well as organizational purposes. One aspect that had already gained popularity in 2014 was that of presumably secure digital communication channels, such as, for example, Telegram or FireChat, and later on, in last year, also Signal. But in 2019, multiple groups also set up new digital tools such as live maps, tracking police presence, and live streams also became increasingly popular. Other new tactics were increased localization of protests, bringing them into the neighborhoods of activists and thus engaging with the local citizens. So literature on contentious action and political participation highlights the importance of perceived grievances as a predictor for potential participation in both violent and non-violent engagement. Commonly described as perceived injustice, or maybe through perceived deprivation, we decided to operationalize grievances through socio-economic and political satisfaction. In fact, grievances as lone predictors are contested, and increasingly, research has examined pathways to participation based on collective and political efficacy as well. Both have been successfully tested in various studies as predictors for social movement engagement. Individuals who perceive collective action as an effective measure to achieve a goal are also more willing to engage in violent and in non-violent protests. In respect to political self-efficacy, on the other hand, recent studies have found that it may be negatively correlated with support for unauthorized activities. This finding could carry many implications for policymaking, and thus we wanted to test it in the context of Hong Kong, as previous studies have merely examined protest action in democratic societies in this regard. Next slide, please. No, sorry. But while these concepts have been applied in social movement research, questions regarding their applicability for youth participation remain largely unanswered. Although youth are often described as apolitical in public discourse, scholars have found that young people are active, but in different ways from earlier generations. Youth choose more non-institutionalized channels and different forms of civic engagement, and are particularly active online. Especially following the Arab Spring, the role of digital channels in youth protest activities has gained in popularity. And with this focus, a clear dualist distinction in the study of civic engagement in the digital age developed, dividing between online and offline engagement. Research has found that the low threshold online participation offers can empower youth and is strongly correlated with offline types of engagement. It has been argued that individuals are offered easy access through social media or forums. Seemingly less politicized platforms have an advantage for mobilization, actually, as they may reach disengaged or uninterested groups and even offer more personalized ways to political action. This can be seen impressively in Hong Kong through the fast adaptation of events into mimified communication online. Creative uses of the internet, for example, creating videos or maintaining blogs, can empower young people and offer them new ways to engage. Furthermore, there is a strong positive association between expression on social media and offline political participation. Additionally, network communication online may foster collective identification and thus potential engagement in group activities both on and offline. Which brings us to our research questions. We wanted to examine in what types of protest activities Hong Kong University students engaged to support the movement. Secondly, whether the different kinds of protest activities that were most common were better distinguishable by mode or by nature. And finally, we wanted to see how students' collective and political self-efficacy, as well as their satisfaction with the political and socio-economic situation in Hong Kong associated with participation in the social movement. And with this, I hand over to Frank to give you insights into our data and analysis.
Thank you, Anna. So in June 2020, we collected data from 408 second-year students of local origin here in Hong Kong from 2 universities. Most of them were female. On average, these students were at that time 19 years and a couple of months old, and a majority of them had actually already participated in another survey in the spring of 2019 before the social movement had gained momentum. And for the current presentation here, we focus on variables including gender and age, collective efficacy and political self-efficacy, both measured in 2019 and 20, with one caveat for collective efficacy, which I mentioned on the next slide. And in 2020, we also measured their satisfaction with the political, social, and economic situation in Hong Kong, as well as their self-reported participation in activities to support the social movement, and as well as their intended participation in the future, for which we have 2 items. So on this slide, we see that, first of all, low scores here mean low efficacy or low satisfaction, and high scores mean that there are high levels of efficacy or students were highly satisfied. And what we see here is that the levels of political self-efficacy were, well, below the scale mean, but they were higher in 2020 compared to 2019. For collective efficacy, we see that these levels were moderate. And here, unfortunately, we can't compare them directly across these 2 years because we used different items in 2019 and 2020 to measure these this variable. And the satisfaction variables were measured only in 2020. And what we see here is that students were rather unsatisfied with political development in Hong Kong, with the possibilities to influence political decisions here in Hong Kong, whereas the levels of satisfaction with socio-economic situation in Hong Kong, such as the living condition or employment opportunities, were moderate. So let's turn to the first focus of our presentation, the kinds of protest activities in which students participated to support the social movement. And what we see on this slide is that students reported high levels of participation in a range of activities, both online and offline, to support the social movement. In fact, 88% of the students, of the local students that we surveyed in June 2020, said that since June 2019, they had done at least one of these activities shown on this slide. And there were also some rarely mentioned activities are particularly noteworthy here, such as students said, for instance, that they had created materials such as artwork or videos to support the movement, or they also had translated articles or wrote passages to spread information about the social movement online to raise awareness of the social movement. And on this slide, we see that radicalization can also be seen as over a quarter of the students that we surveyed said that they had participated in some form of unauthorized activity to support the movement since June 2019. We also see that 4 out of 5 students said that they were planned to support the social movement in the future when we asked them in 2020. And almost a third of these students was even willing to participate in protest activities that might involve a confrontation with the police. Now, remember that we collected these data in June 2020, which was shortly before the national security law in Hong Kong was passed. So the second focus of our presentation is whether students' participation can be best described by or differentiated by the nature of the activities or the mode. And for this, we conducted an exploratory factor analysis, which for which I show the scree plot here. And we see that there were 2 eigenvalues that were bigger than 1. And 3, the eigenvalue 3, also marked the turn from vertical to horizontal. And this suggests that there are 2 factors of participation that we can use. And interestingly, when we further inspected these activities and the factors, we found that there was no clear delineation between offline and online activities. Instead, what we found was the first factor measuring forms of reporting and communication associated with creating materials, texts, or groups. 25% of all students that we had surveyed said that they had done something like this since June 2019. And the second factor captured students' participation in collective demonstrations and other more passive protest behaviors, such as boycotting services. And here, 83% of all students that we surveyed said that they had done at least one of those activities. The first factor was highly skewed, and therefore we decided to just compare whether or not students had done any of these activities. Whereas for the second, this was more or less normally distributed, and therefore we used the whole range of this scale for further analysis. And this brings us to the third focus of this presentation. What are the associations of efficacy and satisfaction with participation in the social movement? And here we see the bivariate associations of these variables with both forms that I just showed, as well as participation in unauthorized activities to support the movement. And there are 2 things that are noteworthy here. First is that collective efficacy before the movement was unrelated, was not statistically significantly related to participation in those movement activities. This is similar in the cross-sectional data for 2020, where we, but here we also see that there was a small but significant positive correlation with the second type of activities, those forms of protest activities in which students participate. This could indicate that participation in protests might have raised students' collective efficacy, but since the items that we used in 2020 and 2019 were different, we can't really test this. And the second thing that is noteworthy here is that satisfaction is negatively correlated with all kinds of protest activities, but these correlations are decidedly stronger for political satisfaction when compared with socioeconomic satisfaction. Now, remember that the satisfaction variables were only measured in 2020, and therefore we decided here to look only at students' intentions to support the movement in the future, more generally, as shown here, or in more confrontation protests, as shown on one of the next slides, as our outcome variables. And what we see here is that older students were somewhat more willing were more likely to intend to support the movement in the future. Those who had high levels of collective efficacy, who felt that as a group they could achieve political goals, were more likely to intend to support the movement in the future. And those who were less satisfied with the political situation and opportunities to influence politics in Hong Kong were more likely to intend to support the movement in the future. And what's interesting here is that political self-efficacy turned from a significant to a non-significant predictor when in the second step, we added students' self-reported participation in those different types of activities that they had reported since June 2019. And this is a finding, so I will skip these slides. And this is a finding that we also see here for more radical participation, students' willingness to participate in protests that might involve a confrontation with the police. So here also political self-efficacy turned non-significant once we added students' self-reported previous participation in the movement. And the same applies here also for political satisfaction, whereas collective efficacy remained a significant and positive predictor. So students who felt that as a group they could achieve political goals were more likely to be willing to participate in confrontational protests in the future. And again, remember that we collected these data before the national security law was passed. Now, we also had anticipated that there would be some interactions between efficacy and satisfaction, but surprisingly to us, there was none of the two-way interactions was actually statistically significant. So, but since we found that particularly political self-efficacy, but also satisfaction in the second analysis here, turned non-significant once we added student self-reported participation in the movement. What we then did in a more exploratory approach here, examine interactions between the efficacy or satisfaction variables with students' reported participation in the movement. And what we found here is that collective efficacy was significantly associated with both forms of intended participation if they had not previously participated in those more creative forms of activities to support the movement. And this applied for both forms of intended participation that we showed earlier. Then we also found that the negative association between political satisfaction and students' intention to more generally support the movement in the future became weaker and weaker the more active they had already been in the movement. And those who were highly active in the movement, when we had already been highly active in the movement when we surveyed them in 2020, for them political satisfaction or dissatisfaction didn't play any role anymore in intending to support the movement in the future. And furthermore, for unauthorized activities, so students' political satisfaction was negatively associated with their willingness to participate in potentially confrontational protests if they had already participated in unauthorized activities in the movement. Now, remember that political self-efficacy was always became a non-significant predictor in those models, but then we did not find any interaction with participation in the movement. So what we then did, because for efficacy we actually had longitudinal data, we looked at potential indirect associations. And what we saw here is that students were more active, reported more activities in those the second type of protest activities, those like boycotting things or participating in mass demonstrations. The more politically efficacious they felt already before the movement had started. And their participation in the movement subsequently mediated this association between efficacy and their intention to support the movement more generally, but also their willingness to participate in more radical protest activities. And interestingly, we did not find this association, this mediation for collective efficacy. We only found this for political self-efficacy. So let's wrap this up. We found that students participated in a range of online and offline activities to support the social movement. Even though few students, when we asked them in the spring of 2019, said that they were planning to do those activities within the coming 12 months. So this underlines research that the young people in Hong Kong are not politically apathetic and that they can be mobilized rather quickly for public causes. Second, we also examined how the activities in which the students participated to support the movement can be differentiated. And here, interestingly, we did not find a clear delineation by mode of participation. Rather, students, the factors that we found were more like creating materials, text, and so on, versus participating in collective demonstrations or other more passive protest behaviors. And this is of relevance here because first, some scholars actually talk about expressive and creative forms of participation. And our analysis here underlines that there are creative forms of participation, but this is not just online. These creative forms of participation can also be offline. And secondly, there's a lot of research that looks at online versus offline participation. And sometimes some researchers just use one item to measure online participation, such as asking respondents how often they post their political opinion on social media. Now, what we see in our analysis is that there is a broad range of activities in which people can participate online for political causes. And asking just this one question about social media and posting their political opinion seems to be rather narrow. Therefore, future studies should also be mindful of this and also think about other activities, other political activities in which people can be active online and not just posting something on social media. And third, we also found that students who were less satisfied with the political situation and the opportunities to exert political influence in Hong Kong were more willing to participate in the future, and they were also more active. And interestingly, their dissatisfaction with the socio-economic situation in Hong Kong was not significantly associated with our outcomes once we accounted for other variables. And that's relevant because there has been a long debate in Hong Kong about that dissatisfaction with the living condition or social issues is the reason why young people became active in the movement. And our analysis, despite cross-sectional, provides some indication that it's really about the political situation with which they are dissatisfied, and that's why they become so active. We also found differences between efficacy and satisfaction. What I would like to mention here before I close is that we found that some variables, including satisfaction, political satisfaction, as well as political self-efficacy, turned non-significant in some of the analysis. And what subsequent analysis indicated to us is that, well, it might be that once these young people were already quite active in certain activities to support the movement, it didn't matter anymore whether they, well, were dissatisfied or not, because it more or less started to become a habit. So this would then allow us the tentative hypothesis that it is important to address political concerns and dissatisfaction in a timely fashion. And a last note, of course, as a reminder, many of the analyses that we reported here were cross-sectional in nature, and they need to be followed up. We actually collected new data just very recently, but we haven't had the time to analyze these by today yet. But we are going to do this over the summer to see whether our hypotheses actually hold also longitudinally and whether there have been any changes since the national security law has been passed. So here are some of our references, and then would like to thank you, and I yeah, give back to Xiaohu.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, Anna, as well. So you have a great presentation, and we do have questions coming in, but I'd like to hold off until our second presentation is done. So let me introduce the second presentation for today. It is titled The Impact of Technological Transformations on the Digital Generation, Case Studies from Estonia, Greece, and the United Kingdom. The speaker is Professor Athena Karasogianni, who is a professor in the University of Leicester. Um, um, Professor Athena is in the area of media and communication. Um, she is both interested in empirical research and the theoretical problems emerging from the ICT use by social movement, protest, and insurgency groups. Let's welcome Professor Athena Karasogianni.
Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me to your series. So it's a very topical subject, and I was fascinated by the previous presentation by Frank and Nana, and this is very important research. And I was thinking, because recently there was the anniversary as well of the Tiananmen Square, and I remember vividly, like literally thousands of people in that stadium, you know, on the anniversary in Hong Kong. And it's a joy to to talk at at your university. I remember teaching there back in 2014 in April, a course on cyber culture, and engaging with your students that seemed very, very engaged on the subject of digital activism. And so it is a real pleasure to be here, and thank you. I'm gonna now share my presentation. Please let me know in case you cannot see it or anything like that, because sometimes we have technical difficulties. Is this okay? You can see this?
Yeah, we can see it well.
Okay, so today I'm going to present the first stage of a three-part research that we're doing of the Horizon 2020 project. There is that involves many countries. It's called DigiGen, the digital transformation, the new generation, and the new digital generation. And this is a work we do on ICT and civic participation between Greece, Estonia, and the UK, comparative study. This is the first stage, which was online interviews. We did 65 online interviews in total in the three countries. The second stage will involve digital storytelling workshops in these countries, 2 or 3 each in each country, where we're going to be co-researching and co-creating digital storytelling regarding civic participation. And the third stage is actually doing policy document analysis in the three countries. So this was these interviews and the online observation, online content collection as part of an ethnographic study. Of course, I'm not going to spend time explaining ethnography. Hopefully people by now, you know, it's been going on for about 10, 15 years, Robert Kozinet's methodology. It was conducted between September and April. It was difficult field work. It was from the start meant to be an online interviews and all. It was designed like that. So, but it was difficult in relation to in regards to finding participants and so on because of the pandemic. But we did manage it, and I hope that you enjoy the results. What we wanted to do is, what we chose to do rather, is focus on strong and dominant online movements and online-offline hybrid movements, right? In relation to racial, social, and environmental justice that were dominant in the three countries. So what we wanted to basically answer is the why and how, right? So why do the participants engage? in our research participants engaged in civil participation in the 3 countries, what might be the similarities and differences by comparison, looking at ideology, identity, community framing, socioeconomic and gender factors. And the second question was, how do participants engage in civil participation? The way, what are the similarities, digital affordances, surveillance, censorship, organization, mobilization, how are they online and offline actually doing this? So, so each country then came up with sort of focusing on the most dominant strands at the time of the fieldwork. So in Greece, the team in Greece, led by Dimitris Parsanoglu and Maria Simeonaki, looked at this primary data, youth activism, mobilizing against gender-based violence and anti-police brutality. In Estonia, it involved LGBTQ+ and Black Lives Matter. And in the UK, we looked at Black Lives Matter and environmental civil participation in terms of the Extinction Rebellion and XR youth, Extinction Rebellion youth. Now, what we were hoping to contribute to is this, like several areas in relation to digital citizenship. Of course, it's now has become part of the agenda of the European Commission quite heavily. Like last month, you might have noticed a discourse there. Also, the digital media used by adolescents specifically, because these people were interviewed in the majority of the interviews were between 16 and 18. So we're talking about adolescents, although in the UK, we chose to also interview older activists and ask them about, to reminisce about their civic participation earlier on in their lives and how this actually developed in relation to ICT. Also, my area of expertise is digital activism, how sort of the repertoires we see there, leadership emergent theories, social movements, and so on. And then in terms of the youth political culture in each country, right? And then try to identify cross-cultural continuities and discontinuities that may emerge. So in the Greek case study, what is interesting, and I am from Athens, so I am a Greek. I haven't lived there for decades now, but I'm familiar with the political culture. There was a hashtag MeToo movement, and that emerged in Greece in the last 6 months because there were scandals of sexual harassment and across, so there was like a lot of that going on. So it took off for the first time. Of course, we know that hashtag MeToo, one of the first ones was in India, like many years ago, and then it developed later on. But in Greece, it arrived quite late, and it had to do with various scandals that came about. And the other movement had to do with anti-policing and heavy policing in the streets. So there was like, if you see on the right-hand side, there's a little kid there saying parks are for me to play and laugh, not to hear the word I'm hurting because of the police violence. So in Greece, the material that was collected came from formal or quasi-formal campaigns. Some examples, Me Too Greece, Dogia, that was actually led by the police ministry and a citizen protection campaign basically as well. But then you had material coming from collectivities, you had material coming from activists that were engaging either on the anti-police brutality or gender-based violence. This is some of the type of nature of participants that were interviewed. And then some of the stories that were told there in terms of motivations, you had identity building. For example, my identities and personally I felt oppressed, and I started my activation on this matter, anti-sexism. The socialization that became part of students at the university based on their own experience of in the case of sexual harassment or on police brutality, was inspired by their own experiences, but also you have the triggering through specific events that happen. So you have like police going into a specific area, and then you have a demonstration countering that. The other issue has to do in Greece with Partification School. So basically, that you have in universities in Greece, the unions are very much dominated by political parties. But there is distrust in the political system as well. So you have people choosing how to participate also outside political parties. So it's very important because there is this distrust on the political system. And then you have also the sense of belonging and how sort of the generational aspect, like sharing activism, sharing this participation, how does this happen, and the intergenerational issue, which I'm going to come back to the other countries as well. Also in, excuse me, in Greece, another thing that was important is that there is a distrust, although like social media are used for diffusing, monitoring, you know, and all that, there is a distrust of the dominant social media platforms that is significant. And that there's understanding about publicizing and so on, but that in Greece, this is not seen as a place for strategy and deliberation so much. So there are issues about censorship, what's going to happen after COVID, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Then there is an interesting thing that is happening in relation to online and offline, that face-to-face communication cannot be compared. So you have like this emphasis that it is really about being in the street. The street is more important. We cannot abandon it. So there's an emphasis on the offline activity. And now moving on to, because I know there's the issue of time, I'm moving now to the Estonia case, where you have Katrin Tinderberg leading the study there. And what you have there is ensuring, and in the sample of the interviews, there was an emphasis on looking at the more disadvantaged kind of participants, like taking into account of socioeconomic factors and so on. And here you have this idea that the Estonian youth basically was always seen as much more passive, before, like traditionally, but then you have now this new kind of generation coming in that seem to be far more active. So in Estonia, we had 32 interviews, like half or almost, there was half, like 1/3 rather, that was LGBTQ rights, and then there was another third that was BLM, and then there was a sample that was kind of, let's say, contextual sample that was not belonging to either of the two. So you can have some sense of comparison, and of course, and I'm going to share some of what they found. Here we have a participant to say everyone should have equal opportunities, treated equally. There's an emphasis of this equality. And then you have what happens in Estonia that also happens in the UK as well, is that you have this overlap of issues. If somebody is part of one movement, they might be part of the other. And then you have some reactions here, some quotations. You have in relation to LGBT, so like an example here, my ideology is that it's not my business whom someone loves. All demonstrations are questionable. I understand the message and pro the message. They don't have, so they have like the context group, if you see, is like juxtaposed to participants of LGBTQ. And you can see that there's this difference where the activist is saying this hatefulness and lack of tolerance spread will end up, you know, like Poland in this case they're referring to. So you have reactions to perceived injustice. So that's, I think, the grievance story, basically, and how the political context is. And then you have this sense of political self-efficacy. It's important for me, and I'm quoting this participant, it's important for me I value other people as much as I value myself. Because I have this privilege, I have the option of saying, I don't want to deal with this. So that this self-awareness, basically, that I am privileged and speaking about an injustice happening somewhere else. And I think in the Estonia case, this was happening with participants that they were speaking for, right? Because the minority in Estonia, of course, is the ethnic Russian minority. It's not that you have issues that come up with, there's not a significant Black or Asian minority in any case, right? So the other thing that became important was in relation to heteronormative masculinity and ethnicity, where you have girls being like more active than boys here. And then you have this, because it was about LGBTQ, but also you have this, like in parallel, this anti-sexual violence protest, online protest, especially I think on Instagram in the Estonian case, and experiencing discrimination. And that was, I mean, this is a global movement in any case. Other interesting things had to do with the reasons for engaging, and also that the youth in Estonia openly acknowledge the central role of social media. This is youth that is not as distrustful of social media as Greece, as in Greece, for sure. And they're more optimistic about, and that could actually, you can make some allusions, some kind of thinking there in relation to how the digital political culture is in the two countries and the political system, and so which maybe we can discuss during the questions. Then you have social media affordances, and the discussion about this. Here, like social media, like act as a source of belonging, then like creating, socializing, create identity, but it also is a place of political deliberation, which is not as much clear in the case of Greece. Then you have family as a political, as a socializer, and you have the issue there of having different political opinions than your own parents, right? So they're talking a lot about that their own political ideology is different to their family. I mean, this is an example here. I've stopped speaking to one half of my family because they are racist or because they're homophobic and so on. Also, this tension in relation to, particularly to LGBTQ, is a serious issue, and this divergence from political opinion from the family. And in the ages we're talking about, really young ages, this is quite important to differentiate and build how you participate politically. And you have this belonging on social media communities or on Instagram or whatever else, more than you feel that you belong in your own family, kind of story. Now I'm gonna talk about the United Kingdom. The case study, we had two case studies here, many case studies. The Black Lives Matter in the UK, we focused on this protest, offline and online. Offline, I went to the protest here in Leicester, which was one of the biggest protests in the last 20 years. It is important to say that Leicester demographically is over 50% non-white. And there is an experience in the UK of police brutality in certain parts of the population, and so it found a lot of resonance. So the US George Floyd murder-inspired protest in the US meant that exactly a year ago, on the 6th of June, the anniversary was yesterday, there was a very significant protest here in Leicester, and I interviewed participants, and I created a workshop with activists in that movement in September, where we talked further with other academics and people from a local council here and so on. And then the second case study was in relation to, it was Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion has been very active in the UK, as particularly since April 2019. So these are the two things I'm going to talk about. This is some examples of what you would do you would see broadly. And I'll take an example, a very dominant platform in this was Facebook. And here I focused, of course, on in the UK pages that had to do with the UK. And you can see Bristol, very active. You can see and bottom there, the protest I'm referring to last June, on the 6th of June, the Clock Tower protest, but there were protests also in Scotland, in other places in the UK. And also it inspired, inspired also what was already a tradition in the UK. It was a Black History Month, right? So that is the, like it tied into this kind of thing. Of course, I will not go and talk about the longer history of the BLM movement. I'm sure people can go and read that anywhere. I just want to mention specifically one of the founders of BLM, Alicia Garza. And I find it very interesting when she's talking about, let's say, the how, right? And how it is organized. And she's talking about leaderful organization and not leaderless. Of course, there's the scholarship on this to go beyond the male charismatic heterosexual figure of the Black liberation movement. She's talking about chapter leads that make decisions about their own chapter, but also the larger network. And this is what I found very interesting in her thoughts on this as a leader of the movement, that decentralized leadership, right, means that you have more process necessary. And when you have a misapplication of decentralized leadership, it means that we have to let, she says, we have to let go of many opportunities to make important interventions, because we were like too relied on this slower process of decentralized leadership. And I'm gonna come back to this. This is on the left-hand side down, this is a picture I took at the Leicester protest. And on the right-hand side is the event we did. Now, why Leicester had an additional story to it was that it was the city in the UK that stayed longer in lockdown and continues lockdown for months on end. And the reason was that it was a city where there were dark factories, we call them, or factories that have very low wages and exploitation, and they were not following the pandemic COVID safety rules, which meant that in those kind of areas of food and garment industries, you had a surge, right, of cases. So in June, you had almost like this coinciding of both protesting the Black Lives Matter, and also in relation to Leicester being in lockdown, and why was that the case? So it was addressing social, socio-economic inequality as well, and work practices and labor issues, right? Now I'm going to talk about the Extinction Rebellion. Again, I'm just showing some groups here to make sure I explain that Extinction Rebellion and Extinction Rebellion youth are Extinction Rebellion youth sees itself as autonomous, and we're talking about organization that the XR youth. The average age is like 12 years old, like they're very young. And they see themselves autonomous from XR main or central, as they call it, right? So these are some examples. There were significant actions, even in the autumn. There was significant, there was a rebellion in 2020 when we came out of the lockdown, the first lockdown, but the movement was dormant during the first lockdown, which was in the UK, was between March and the summer, right? And this is where the movement used that time to restructure. Now, some examples of some media use here, and I want to show you here on the left. If you see, it says climate justice, racial justice. This is a rebellion after June, so this is in the autumn, right, of 2020. And I wanted to say something about live streaming, because as you can see, I don't know if you see like the blue, there's two pictures with a blue frame, and this is where you have live streaming from on top of a tree. Right, so there's like somebody like talking. There is this like a blonde woman there who is holding, and this is actually has gone live streaming from somewhere. And somebody's interviewing her about it. And on the top of the picture, you have somebody like using sign language for as well. So this is some examples of the autumn, and I think live streaming is very important for Extinction Rebellion. I wanted to mention this. Now, in terms of organization, this is screenshots actually I took, kind of cheekily took on self-organizing training workshops. So I went to quite a few of their training. So the talk workshop about joining Extinction Rebellion, self-organizing, also like different types of training. So this is how they organize. Basically is there is a, and I will put the report in the chat so you can read more detail about that. But you have a system of organizing called holacracy, where they try to mitigate between a very centralized architecture, a very horizontal architecture, and decisions are made by consent. So it means that if you don't agree with the group, you have to explain, and we won't give you consent, you have to explain because why, and make your case why this would be harmful to the group. So you have different groups with internal and external coordinators as well. There's a mechanism called tensions that resolves differences. There's like a facilitator for discussions, the different hubs and rebel hubs and so on. I will put things in the report in the chat so you can have a look. What is important with XR is that there was experimentation with platforms outside, let's say, the dominant tech platforms, right? So for Basecamp was used, but then it had to be rethought because they had to leave the platform basically because it couldn't scale after like so many thousands of people went on it. Then there was international media and interviewed the activist that was leading in that, where they decided to for storage to use a server in Switzerland because it's carbon neutral. So it goes like there's an ideological impact, right, on the choices they're making, but also law enforcement because they don't easily just give things away is the Swiss kind of law. There's also the use of Mattermost, which is an open source version of Slack. Glassfrog is a commercial app, and this is the pictures I showed you from for the organizing are from there. So Glassfrog is where they go and look at the roles they are assigned and their activities and their duties to the organization. And then there was change from WhatsApp to Signal and Telegram at some point after April 2019 because of issues of data protection and privacy. And also during the pandemic, there's lots of restructuring, and there was complaints about the in that restructuring complaints about their organizational the organizational qualities of holacracy because it was taking them longer basically to make decisions how to restructure because of the system by consent that became basically a bit of a like muddle, as in the case of Occupy consensus building. That's what they want to avoid, but it seems that it was causing problems. And of course, you have mass audience publicity, the usual platforms. Some quotes from the XR participants are very interesting here, and I alluded to them. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm trying to wrap this up now. So one is that Extinction Rebellion is a broad church, so there are disagreements in relation to strategy or tactics. An XR youth activist, I said before, is saying that look, we are more radical. We are a different culture. There's a different culture between different groups. We're focused more on supporting racial justice, but we do try to improve the relationship. Now, why this is interesting is because XR Youth went and occupied a meeting of the main XR, and with like a broad cinnamon buns basically in that meeting, saying we need more say in this movement if we're going to be part of it. So there are tensions there, and they're trying to resolve these tensions. The issue of it being a broad church, right, is that you have, for example, an XR Youth that I interviewed that said that he was a member of the Tory party, right, and saying that, well, in some issues I'm like this, in some issues I'm like that. But he left the Tory party because of the anti-protest bill, right? So then you have some quotation from the BLM Leicester participants, where you have, and what is important here is that the very young, they were very young, teenage to early 20s that came up that wanted to do the BLM protest in Leicester, and they were mentored and supported by all the very much established anti-racist organizations in Leicester, and there are plenty of those. So you have like this discussion of older activists saying, well, you know, we helped them out, but they knew what they were doing. They were very good in mobilizing through social media and so on. And then there's another participant here who is white, but he's saying, well, I did support them, I did go to them because my cousins are mixed race and they have experience of being stopped in regular search and have bad experience from the police. And the interesting thing, if you look at, just to try to wrap up here, if you look at making some comparisons between the three countries, you have Estonian participants that are less worried about privacy and surveillance. This is a country with very strong e-government tradition. Estonia, as in electronic Sonia, Estonia. Greek participants are far more distrustful of political parties, but also commercial platforms that the Estonians are. And they see ICT less space for organization and strategy than UK participants do. UK participants differ in the sense that it's more organization, communication, innovation than in the other two cases. But the three countries also exhibit similarities. Politicization is triggered by personal life experience, and also triggered by anger around the specific events in terms of inequality, racial and social environmental justice, injustices, right? And although there are similar platforms, of course, you know, because it's a global social media platform environment, you have Estonians using more Instagram and TikTok than Greek participants, and you have similarities in Twitter is used for information and deliberation, but in relation to UK, you have this issue of talking about we only use Facebook to reach parents, you know, for our events from the very young activists. So here is basically more in terms of a table, so it's kind of easier to kind of look at in a way. But I'm done, and I'm sorry if I've taken a bit longer. I'm aware that I had like to cover like all my colleagues' kind of contributions here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Athena, for this very wonderful presentation of so many different case studies in the DigiGen project. So now it's coming to the time for our discussant, Dr. Francisco Bailo. Dr. Bailo is the expert on the use of digital and social media in politics. His doctoral dissertation was on online political participation. And Dr. Bailo has a very rich life experience. He had worked for the Australian government, non-government organizations, and the United Nations. And he also lived in some countries that we only longing for. So this like Afghanistan, Guatemala, Mauritius, and Ecuador. So let's welcome Dr. Bailo.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the three presenters, Frank, Anna, and Athena. I think the really exciting and interesting cases. So we're talking about, of course, youth participation in 4 different contexts. So of course we have 3 Europeans, European contexts that have some similarities, but also interesting differences. Greece and the UK are definitely not the same country, although they are part of the same continent. And then, of course, we have Hong Kong that is extremely interesting because of the current political development there, and I mean the long trajectory of the umbrella movement. So it's very interesting to put all this together in the same talk, but it's also quite challenging somehow for my case to try to connect the two presentation and find interesting themes or interesting dimension that allow us to appreciate these two very interesting and insightful presentation and research projects. So the first thing I like to start discussing, or better to raise the attention on, is why is it interesting to investigate the youth. So what do we learn from that? So I think that, of course, one of the most interesting aspects of youth participation through digital means is the fact that youth participation scale low in terms of traditional youth in general. The youth scales low in terms of traditional participation. If you think about voting, okay, they tend to be much lower in terms of participation in the in elections, but also they scale much higher when it comes to digital engagement. Okay, so we have these two differences that might, of course, they characterize the demographics specifically, but might also be interesting to understand the behavior out of this specific demographics. Okay, so what happens when we have very low level of traditional participation and very high level of engagement, or very high digital literacy, we can say. So very strong familiarity with the tools that allow them to communicate through the internet and to receive and read information through the internet. So this is, again, why I think it's so interesting to investigate this specific demographic, and why we can also use it to link to other research. Then the other thing, I think, issue that have been discussed by the three presenters is the cycle between dissatisfaction on one side and disengagement on the other side. So this is, of course, a broad issue and a broad problem. We know that people that are highly dissatisfied with the current political situation for different reasons also tend to disengage from the same system, okay? And we know that this is profoundly dysfunctional if we think about the overall system that should deliver, especially to the people that are more likely to have grievances, okay? So how do you break this cycle of dissatisfaction, disengagement, and further dissatisfaction? Of course, the internet can be part of this equation, okay? Because we know that if you're dissatisfied with the current institutional system, with the current political system, and find all the discussion that happens within this institution. So it was interesting what Athena mentioned, the fact that people found parties and traditional or also unions, so the traditional institutions of politics, toxic. Okay, so they basically see that no matter what they're discussing, no matter the issue that they're raising, these institutions, traditional institutions, are toxic, so we should basically not even approach them, okay? So the internet can break these cycles, I think. So that's a very interesting question, and that's why I think it's interesting to investigate this. So one possible way out of this cycle is, of course, internet engagement. The other one that I think was mentioned in the two presentations, it's grievances. Okay, so we know that, of course, dissatisfaction can lead to grievances, and at one point the grievances will basically reach to an unsustainable level, and then people will start to activate and be active. So this, I think, as a very interesting theme that in some sense connects the two presentations. And then I think also these two presentations help us to, at least help me to, focus more specifically on the most important questions in this field. So in research and political engagement online. So the first question is, what is political participation? Okay, so we need to have a better understanding of how we qualify political participation. And that's why I think it's interesting, again, to try to understand whether it's still meaningful to talk the online, offline. I mean, it is meaningful. We have to do it because, of course, people will still refer to the two dimensions as different. But again, what is the political participation in this hybrid system? Wouldn't it be better maybe to think about what is politically influential, okay? And then I was really inspired by the presentation by Frank and Anna, especially, and their focus on the different range of activities there. So we maybe, again, talking about political participation as one monolith is not useful, is not functional to get a better understanding. Maybe what we should try to do is instead to break down the different activities without a very strong differentiation between the online and offline. Actually, I think what this was an interesting interesting finding that they found at the council from their presentation. Then another interesting question, of course, is why do we participate? And then, of course, I leave the two papers to discuss more in details. But in general, I think that what they pointed out, especially when it comes to the youth, so when it comes to a population that is, on average, disengaged from, at least from a traditional institution. So what is really important, of course, are trigger events. So I like, I think, what Atina mentioned, the term that they use. So you have this population that is dormant politically, but is ready to be engaged if something happens. So something happened can be, of course, a trigger event, so a specific case of police brutality, but can also be, as far as I understand from the results presented by Frank and Anna, a successful protest. Okay, so we know that if the protest by itself reach a critical mass and turns into something that is successful, maybe not politically, but definitely has an impact on the media, then of course this can create a positive effect on further mobilization and further engagement, because people see that the collective efficacy, so that collective efficacy dimension, see that protest is useful. It is useful to reach some sort of political objective, maybe just getting attention, and then we'll further engage in this. So this again is a very interesting, I think, question that we want to try to address. So why do people participate? What triggers participation in a population that with a relatively low level of engagement in a traditional institution? Then, I mean, there are many very interesting, then of course time is short. There are many very interesting findings that I heard today, just a few. So finding that according to the paper presented by Frank and Anna, 83% of Hong Kong students actually engage politically. I mean, that's an incredible high number if you compare it to anything in Europe, I guess, or I mean Australia or in the US. So 83%, of course, identify a very, very actively engaged politically engaged population. So, and that is also interesting if you link into the other finding that you presented, that economic grievances are not that significant in predicting and further engagement than political grievances. So that, of course, is interesting, not just for us, but it is as a very interesting political value. And so the question being, of course, how is China expected to settle this if without providing some sort of a political freedom, because of course it seems likely that economic benefits down the road will not be enough to diffuse the situation here. So that was definitely a very interesting result. Another interesting, and then I conclude because I think my time is almost up. Very, very interesting insights from Athena's presentation that I really like. I think it's quite inspiring in terms of new research, is the fact that, of course, we start from the assumption that people engage online because, especially young people engage online because they distrust traditional institutions. Well, we have seen that, I mean, at least in the case of Greece and in the case of the UK, we shouldn't also give for granted trust towards social media. So the social media application that they are using every day to bypass traditional institutions are also not neutral in the sense that they might trust or distrust them. Okay, so it was interesting the fact that, for example, Greece doesn't really trust Facebook, and also interesting that people in the UK, demonstrators in the UK, decided to shift from WhatsApp to Telegram or Signal. And of course, this will be even more relevant, this kind of distrust, if we shift the focus from left-leaning, I'm talking about Europe, the US, left-leaning political movements again in Western countries to right-leaning right-wing leaning movements, then of course the level of distrust for everything that happened would be much, much higher, and will be interesting to see how this all interact together. Yeah, and then the final very interesting concept, very interesting insights from, again, from Athena's presentation was the intersectionality. So as we see movements mobilized through social media, we also see, and probably we should expect more and more intersectionalized, so movements embracing and one with the other. And of course, we should also understand that the political information that travels through the internet is mediated by filtering algorithm. It's the same filtering algorithm that populate our feeds, our Facebook timeline or whatever, our Twitter timeline also negotiates and distribute and diffuse political information. So it makes sense that if you're interested in some specific political movement, well, if the algorithm thinks that you're interested in that, then the algorithm may also think that you might be interested in. So if you're interested in Extinction Rebellion, you might also interested in Black Lives Matters, in the Black Lives Matter protests, and then for this very reason, the social media platform will keep sending you information about the other, the other protest. So this kind of intersectionality, of course, are really interesting. I think they're really worth to investigate, and it's something that I think in the future we should really expect to see more. And that was about 10 minutes, I guess.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vilo. And we do have a question, at least one question from the audience. And it is about how and why the current young people are so political. I think all of our presenters more or less addressed this point already. Are there some complementary points from our presenters and discussants?
I would thank you, Xiao. I would just briefly want to address 2 points. The first is, regarding Francesco's response, thank you so much for this feedback and the points that you've raised. But one important thing that we need to keep in mind is that we had students of local origin. That's what we focused on this presentation. So this is important to remember. We also had some data from other students, international students, students from the mainland. But for this analysis, we had included them because their patterns are, at least for the mainland students, quite different. And another thing is about also another aspect that we've also looked at in our project, but we didn't present that here, is identity and local identity and the fears of mainlandization of Hong Kong, which also seem to play a big role also in their politicization. And I would stop here. If Anna wants to add something here, then please do that. Otherwise, I'll hand back to Xiao.
Yes, maybe just to quickly follow up on what Frank said about mainlandization. Actually, there has been a trend in politicization of Hong Kong youth. Our cohort has been, on an average, about 19 years old. So during the Umbrella Movement, which was the last major protest movement in 2014, they were still quite young. And they experienced not only the blossoming of this movement, but also how it then deteriorated and did not really succeed in reaching its goals. While the previous generation who engaged into the Umbrella Movement had been coming up during a time of several mass movements, starting in 2003, where many of their parents' generation went to the streets to oppose national security legislations in the Article 23, and then several movements which I originally wanted to mention, but for the sake of timekeeping, I omitted, like, for example, the anti-high-speed railway protests or the protests of heritage protection in 2004 for the Queen's Pier. All of those were taking part while that generation was still in high school, and they became politicized. Actually, some of the activists at the time of the heritage conservation protests, they were still active now in the 2019 movement, and they played really important roles. Yeah, so throughout this period, you saw an increasing, sorry, one second. You could see an increasing politicization and awareness of the lack of democratization of the system, which actually was part of the handover agreement. And young Hong Kongers have been fighting for more rights for democratic engagement over the last decade. So I think this is a very important aspect to take into account.
Yes, so one of the most vivid, I think, there are a couple of vivid kind of participants in that regard. There was an XR youth participant that was part of the youth strike, and I also interviewed a youth strike, another youth strike participant that said that after spending time around with XR, they thought that their strategies and tactics were more effective than the youth strike. So they went to XR Youth for that. I mean, we're talking about now people that are already engaged, just to give an example. Then there was an older activist that said in XR again, a very vivid one that said, well, I've been part of all the right organizations, all the NGOs, they were not effective. I thought XR would have more seem more effective to mobilize and make these causes urgent. Nothing is more urgent, and that kind of thing that he found disappointing in previous organizations he was involved in the environmental movement, that sort of motivated to get into it. Now, in relation to the why of BLM in Estonia, because of course there is the issue there is actually with ethnic Russians rather than, well, I mean, there is racism, but it is that they felt they were speaking about injustice, and it was triggered by the events in the United States. But in Estonia, the Estonian youth also talk about tolerance as a rational thing to do, that they are motivated against this extremism and populism. They see themselves as more a center of ideology, actually, which is fascinating. The ones that are not motivated to participate, why they're not, because there was a context group in Estonia, it was because they were fearing in the online environment to be the trolling, or they were distrustful, or they thought it wouldn't make any difference. So like, just to say the ones that didn't, why they didn't as well. And in the case of Greece, a lot has to do with peer and family experience. But in Greece, in the particular cases we're talking about, they're triggered by events. So you have like these sexual harassment scandals and so on, and there's a response to that. So events are very particular. I think that, just to finish, and maybe that is helpful, that also there are event-specific things going on, because in Estonia and in Greece and the UK, you have a polarized political culture. In Greece, because of the anti-austerity protests, the memoranda, and the crisis that the country has experienced, and in the UK, of course, because of Brexit and so on. So you have highly polarized environments. And also the media systems are of a certain kind as well, that are dominated by certain kind of class interests as well. I think Estonia is different in that case. It seems to be a more pluralized, so like when I researched it, like back in 2007-8, because I was interested in the Estonian cyber attacks, the Estonian cyber conflict back then. And what you see is because they have so much more reliance on e-government, and like, so the population is much more convinced of, more trustful, let's say, right, of the digital, and not as distrustful. So the motivation, also in all cases, there's a similarity there. Young people, these are kids that experience the pandemic, they're very young, and they experience a future that is quite dystopian, right? This is a dystopian situation post-pandemic. What is this future going to be like for them in terms of getting jobs and so on? So I think that there is a level of like seeing the issues of injustices, even if it's racial, social injustice or environmental justice, is also about their own future. That's why they are politicized, right? Because also they are responding to events, they're thinking about their own future. And I think that's why they're so kind of vocal, raising their voices, let's say, this generation. Yeah.
May I just wanted to say that what I found really interesting was also the aspect of intersectionality, because this is actually something you could see in Hong Kong as well, even preceding the umbrella movement, because the protests during the high-speed railway, they connected different kinds of stakeholders. Some of them framed the protests as environmental protection protests, because the high-speed railway track was planned to go through some more rural areas. Others framed it as protection of certain modes of living, and again, others were more interested in the factor of opposing the government. So this protest and also anti-mainlandization, which Frank mentioned before, because this railway connection was a faster way to get from Hong Kong into the mainland, but also the other way around. So this connection of different views and the intersectionality, I think, is a very important aspect that we need to continue to look at, because I think it leads to more sustained networks, not necessarily visible action, but networks on the ground. And then what I just realized was that we didn't really touch on the aspect of whether movements are successful in reaching their goal or not. Because in 2012, a youth movement in Hong Kong was actually very successful in reaching its goal to get a bill for the education curriculum reform shelved, while other major movements were not so successful. And I think it's maybe important to look at how this affects not only the activists who are engaged in trying to achieve their goals, but also onlookers of the general public.
Well, thanks for the discussion. We have another question which maybe we can answer it quickly. So because Frank and Anna's research found that in Hong Kong case, the people's grievance strongly related to political system, but not the socio-economic factors. So the question was, are there any other cases in other places like this? So from our presenters, so you are experienced in this topic, did you find in any other cases in the literature or in your own experiences?
Thank you for this question. Actually, I'm not aware of other cases. I'm also not aware that other researchers would have differentiated that clearly. But so we would have to probably do some more searching for literature whether that's the case. But I do think that here the underlying issues always play a role. And apparently in Hong Kong, maybe it's more the political issues that are more important. In other cases, it may be like welfare issues. So which I believe it might also be different from context to context. So our results are interesting, but they would have to be validated in other contexts. And there was also a question about the representativeness that I would just like to briefly address, because I think that's indeed important. So we collected data in 2019 from students from 2 universities, and there were a few more. So overall, female students were more likely to participate in our study. And we used weights to adjust for that. So we've weighted the data so that it's corrected for this difference. And in 2020, the sample is basically similar to that from 2019. except that there was this small difference only with respect to, I think, political self-efficacy. It was very small, but statistically significant, but I don't know whether students who did not participate were more or less efficacious than those who had participated. But with respect to other variables that we had measured in 2019 already, there were no significant differences whatsoever with respect to the 2019 sample.
Can I just add something? Again, maybe then Frank and Anna can clarify. But I mean, I think what was interesting, as far as I understood your modeling, is that economic distress or economic grievances were significant until you actually controlled for an additional set of variables. So that speaks to the fact that probably there is a correlation of some sort among the independent variables. So that also points to the fact that maybe our attention, how we formalize these dimensions of politics, economics, are not that effective in some sense. And then, at least, I mean, they're practically effective, but maybe they're not capturing all the nuances that how people express their grievances more general. So maybe, again, it's not so simple for someone to express the grievances on these two axes, considering them as totally independent.
Okay, thanks for this point. Yes, we saw that there was a correlation, but it was decidedly weaker than that for political dissatisfaction or satisfaction. The both variables are, of course, correlated with each other, but since we have cross-sectional data, we can't say whether there is a causal relationship there as well. There was something I just had in my head that I wanted to say. I think I just slipped my mind again. So, oh yes, right. Of course, we did also here. So we didn't know whether this would be like separate socioeconomic versus political. We actually had a set of items, I think 9 or 10 items, and we then also employed factor analysis first to see. And it seemed that there were two clear factors, or one very clear factor that was political dissatisfaction, and the other which covered all the other items, except for one item that we dropped from the scale entirely.
Well, thanks for the discussion. I'm aware of the time. We are already 15 minutes out of our time minutes. So before we conclude this seminars, I'd like to remind everybody that our next seminar in the series will be in 2 weeks, which is June 21st at the same time. The topic will be growing up digital and digital social capital. And so thanks everybody for joining this seminar, and let's thank our presenters once again for their wonderful presentations and the discussions.